They wanted me to disappear quietly. They wanted me to take what little they offered, say thank you, and never ask for more. For 29 years, I did exactly that. My aunt used to say I was the easy one. She meant it as a compliment. I understood it differently. I was easy because I never pushed back. I never demanded a seat at the table. I just cleared the plates and hoped someone would notice I was still in the room. Growing up in Sudbury, Ontario, our family wasn't what you'd call wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. My father worked at the mine for 31 years. My mother ran a daycare out of the house. We had enough. We had a big backyard, a dock on the lake, Christmas mornings that smelled like my grandmother's butter tarts. I don't want to paint it as all darkness, because it wasn't. There were good years, real ones. But there was always my brother, 6 years older than me, and treated like the sun the whole family orbited around. When he graduated from Laurentian, my parents threw a party that lasted 2 days. When I graduated, same school, same faculty, higher GPA, my mother made a roast chicken and my father said, "That's our girl." That was it. That was the whole thing. I told myself it didn't matter. I was 22 and practical, and I told myself it didn't matter. His name was Garrett. I'll say that now and not much more. He was loud and charming and never held a job for longer than 18 months, and every single time he crashed, our parents caught him. Not gently, enthusiastically, like catching him was their purpose. I moved to Toronto when I was 24, took a job in hospital administration at one of the downtown health networks. It wasn't glamorous, it was scheduling and budgets and navigating union contracts and sitting through meetings that could have been emails, but I was good at it. I worked my way up steadily, the way you do when nobody is handing you anything. That's where I met Nathan. He was doing a guest lecture series through U of T, something about healthcare infrastructure and private investment models. I sat in the back. He said something that made me write it down. Afterward, I went up to ask him a question, and we ended up talking for 40 minutes in the hallway while everyone else filtered out. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee. I said I had to get back to work. He said, "What about Thursday?" I said, "Fine. I want to be clear about something. I did not know, on that Thursday, what Nathan was. I didn't know what he came from, or what he'd built, or what his name meant in certain rooms. He was just a man who listened when I talked, who didn't look past me while I was speaking, who asked follow-up questions like my answers actually mattered to him. We dated for a year and a half before I brought him home. In my defense, I'd told my family about him. I'd mentioned him multiple times. My mother had asked maybe twice, in that distracted way she asks things, half listening, already thinking about Garrett. I had told them Nathan worked in investment and infrastructure. I had told them he traveled a lot. I had told them he was thoughtful and kind and that I was happy. What I had not told them was that Nathan's family founded one of the oldest private equity firms in the country, that he sat on the boards of 3 major hospital networks, including the one I worked for, that the building his company occupied on Bay Street had his family's name on it, or that he owned a property on Georgian Bay that had 12 bedrooms and a dock long enough to land a small aircraft. I hadn't told them because it hadn't come up in any way that felt natural, and because part of me was quietly terrified that once they knew, they would look at me differently. They would stop seeing me and start seeing what they could get. I should have trusted that instinct. The visit was in September. I drove up with Nathan in his car, a dark navy Range Rover that he'd had for 4 years and treated like it was already old. He wore jeans and a gray sweater. He brought my mother flowers and my father a bottle of scotch he'd picked up because I'd mentioned once that my father liked scotch. He remembered things like that. He always remembered. We pulled into the driveway and my mother came out the front door before we'd even turned off the engine. I watched her eyes go straight to the car. Dinner was fine, the way some things are fine while being quietly terrible underneath. My father asked Nathan about hockey. My mother kept refilling his water glass and laughing a little too loudly at things he said. Garrett arrived 40 minutes late, sat at the head of the table even though that was my father's chair, and spent most of the meal talking about a business idea he was developing, something about a franchise, something about investors he was meeting. I watched Nathan nod politely and knew he was being kind. After dessert, Garrett pulled out his phone and started showing Nathan his pitch deck. At the kitchen table, before the dishes were even cleared, my mother leaned forward like she was watching a prize being unwrapped. Nathan said, "I appreciate you sharing this," and then he said a few gentle things about market conditions that I recognized as the diplomatic version of no. Garrett didn't recognize it at all. He talked for another 20 minutes. On the drive home, I said I was sorry. Nathan looked at me sideways and said, "For what?" I didn't have a clean answer. We got engaged the following spring. He proposed at a small restaurant in the annex that neither of us would have recognized as meaningful to anyone else. It was where we'd had our third date, the one where I'd accidentally knocked a full glass of wine into his lap, and he'd laughed instead of flinching. That was when I knew. I called my mother the next morning. She cried, which I wasn't expecting. She asked to see the ring. She asked about the date. She asked if Nathan's family would want to have any say in the venue. I should have caught that. I didn't. We decided on a June wedding. I had envisioned something simple. Immediate family, close friends, maybe 60 people. A barn venue about an hour outside the city that a colleague had recommended, white string lights, wildflowers, a local catering company. It was beautiful. I had photos of it saved on my phone. I showed my mother in November. She went quiet in a way I recognized but kept hoping meant something other than what it meant. "It's very rustic," she said. I said I liked rustic. She said, "I just wonder what Nathan's family will think." I said Nathan was involved in every decision and loved the venue. She said, "Of course he says that." That was November. By January, my mother had spoken to my aunt on my father's side, and to Garrett's girlfriend, and to a woman from her church, and somehow a consensus had emerged. A consensus I had not been consulted about, that the wedding I had planned was embarrassing, too small. The wrong message, something people would talk about. "You're marrying into money," Garrett said on a Sunday call I hadn't been prepared for. "You have to act like it." I said it was my wedding. He said, "It reflects on all of us." There it was, that sentence. I've turned it over so many times since. It reflects on all of us. Not, "We want you to be happy." Not, "We're so proud of you." Just, "How does this make us look?" I stopped sharing details after that. I made the decisions Nathan and I had already made, quietly confirmed the vendors, sent the invitations, and kept my mother at a careful distance from the planning. She interpreted this as me being secretive. I interpreted it as self-preservation. We were both right. 6 weeks before the wedding, my father's mother passed away. Her name was Nora, and I say her name here because she deserves to be said. She was 84. She'd lived independently in her house in New Liskeard until the last year, when her health made that impossible. She had a sharp memory and a dry sense of humor, and she'd always, in her quiet way, paid attention to me. When I graduated, it was my grandmother who called and talked to me for 45 minutes about what I'd studied, and what I wanted to do, and whether I was proud of myself. Not my parents, my grandmother. She had updated her will about 8 months before she died. I didn't know this. Nobody told me. The lawyer contacted me directly in early April. I was at work, sitting at my desk with 3 browser tabs open, eating a sandwich. He introduced himself and explained who he was and asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. He said my grandmother had left me her house in New Liskeard and a sum from her savings that amounted to slightly under $400,000. I put my sandwich down. I said, "I'm sorry, could you say that again?" He repeated it. My grandmother had also left specific notes in the file. This is what the lawyer explained gently, because she had anticipated there might be some reaction from the family. She had left Garrett a small amount and a letter. She had left my parents a piece of furniture and a letter. She had left me everything else with a note that said, simply, that she trusted me to do something good with it. I sat in my office with the door closed for a long time after that call. I did not tell anyone immediately. I told Nathan that evening, and we sat on the couch together, and I cried in a way I hadn't expected. Not from happiness, not exactly. From the feeling of being seen, finally, by someone who was no longer there to see me. My mother called the following Tuesday. She had apparently also spoken with the lawyer. The call lasted 47 minutes, and I will not recount all of it. What I will say is that by the end, my mother had made 3 distinct arguments. First, that my grandmother hadn't been entirely herself in her final months. Second, that as the eldest grandchild, Garrett deserved equal consideration. And third, that because I was now set financially, I should step back and be generous to the people who hadn't had my opportunities. I didn't say much. I took notes, which is a thing I do when I need to stay calm. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. I had already decided. My grandmother had been entirely herself. The will stood. I was not going to redistribute my inheritance to a brother who would spend it in a year and come back for more. But I also understood now what the wedding had become about for them. It wasn't about the venue or the guest list. It was about positioning. They wanted to be close enough to Nathan that it would matter. They wanted access. I sent my mother a message after that call. I kept it short. I said the wedding was proceeding as planned, that the decisions were final, and that I hoped she was looking forward to the day. I added a line that I had not planned to add, but that came out anyway. that the people who loved me had always found a way to show up regardless of the venue, and that I was paying attention to who showed up. She didn't respond for 11 days. When she finally did, she said she had been processing. She said that she and my father and Garrett would be there, of course, but that some of the extended family on her side had decided not to come, as they felt the wedding was not what they'd expected. My aunt specifically had declined. 2 cousins. I looked at that message for a while. Then I called the barn venue and confirmed our final head count. June arrived the way Ontario June arrives, uncertain at first, then suddenly warm, like the weather changed its mind. The morning of the wedding, I was at my hotel room with my 2 best friends, one from university and one from work, and the 3 of us sat on the floor, eating croissants that someone had gone out to get at 6:30 in the morning, and I want to name this precisely, I felt light, not giddy, not anxious, light. Like something heavy had been set down somewhere behind me. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon. The barn was everything I'd imagined. The wildflowers were cream and yellow and pale green. The string lights were on even though it was still bright out, because I'd decided I wanted them on. There were 62 people in those seats, people who had actually responded, who had made travel arrangements, who had called me in the weeks before to say they were excited. 62 people who wanted to be there. My parents were in the 3rd row. My mother wore a dress I hadn't seen before, which I noticed. My father looked the way he always looked at formal occasions, slightly uncomfortable and trying not to show it. Garrett wasn't there. His absence was noted. My mother had mentioned, casually, a week earlier that he had a thing. I had said, okay. The officiant was a woman I'd found through a friend of Nathan's. She was warm and funny, and she'd sat with the 2 of us for 3 hours before the wedding, just to understand who we were. The ceremony was 34 minutes long. It felt like 10. What I remember most is that Nathan cried. Not dramatically. He just had to stop for a moment and press his thumb against his eye and take a breath. And the whole room went quiet in that way. Rooms go quiet when something real is happening. I reached out and held his arm while he collected himself. 62 people, and you could hear the birds outside. Afterward, during the reception, one of Nathan's colleagues came up to me, a woman who'd flown in from Vancouver, and she took both my hands and said, "This was exactly right. This was exactly what a wedding should be." I thanked her. She said, "I mean it. Some of the weddings in our circle feel like they're for the room. This one felt like it was for you." I didn't have words for that, so I just nodded and held on to it. Nathan's family, his mother, his 2 younger sisters, his uncle who'd come from Halifax, were seated near the front and were, without exception, warm. His mother hugged me before the ceremony and after. His youngest sister spent 20 minutes talking to my university friend about a hiking trail in Algonquin. Nobody made anything complicated. My mother found me near the end of the evening. I was standing by the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of something sparkling, watching Nathan's sister dance with my father, who had loosened up considerably by that point. My mother came up beside me and stood there for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Nathan's family is lovely." I said yes, they were. She said, "His mother and I spoke for a bit." I said I was glad. Then she said, "And I want to get this right because the phrasing matters." She said, "I just hope you know that everything we said because we care about how things look for you." I turned to look at her. She was watching the dance floor. I said, "I know how things look for me. I'm standing here." She nodded slowly. I'm not sure she understood what I meant. I wasn't sure I needed her to. We didn't speak again that night. I went back to Nathan and we danced twice more, and then we said goodbye to the last guests around 11 and drove to the hotel, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment in my dress with my shoes off, and Nathan sat next to me, and neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The inheritance settled 2 months later. I used part of it to put toward a property, not the new Liskeard house, which I eventually sold, but a small place on the water in Prince Edward County that Nathan and I had looked at twice and kept coming back to. It needed work. We did most of the planning ourselves, weekends, a lot of iced coffee and bad radio, and the particular satisfaction of making decisions about a space that was entirely ours. My mother called in August. Garrett needed help. He had entered into some kind of business arrangement that had not worked out, and he owed money. A specific amount she mentioned twice, which told me she'd been thinking about this call for a while. She framed it as a loan. She mentioned that family helps family. She mentioned that I was in a position now. I let her finish. I said, "I've thought a lot about position this year." She said she didn't follow. I said, "A year ago when I was planning a wedding that I was excited about, and the people I thought cared about me told me it was wrong and small and embarrassing. I wasn't in any particular position then." but I was still me, the same person. Nothing about me was different. She was quiet. I said, I'm not going to help Garrett. And I'd like to not talk about this again. She said, You've changed. I said, I finally stopped apologizing for being who I am. That might look like change from the outside. I hung up the phone and sat for a minute with it face down on the kitchen counter. Then I went outside, where Nathan was repainting the window trim, and I stood in the yard with the late August sun on my face and the smell of paint and lake water in the air. And I thought about my grandmother sitting in her house in New Liskeard, writing a letter she knew would cause a problem, choosing me anyway. I thought about 62 people in a barn with the lights on. I thought about a man who had to stop and press his thumb to his eye because he loved me. I thought about how easy it is to spend your whole life trying to earn something from people who have already decided what you're worth. I thought about the particular exhaustion of that, and then I thought about how it felt to finally, completely, stop. It felt like stepping out of a room you'd been in so long you'd forgotten there were doors. My phone stayed face down. I picked up a spare brush and helped Nathan with the trim.